Greetings, North Orange County. My name is Martin Chaires, and it's an honor for me to join in on this sermon series titled Beyond Gold as we look at the narrative of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And maybe you've already read Genesis 37 through 50 and have encountered this narrative in fresh and new ways. Maybe you're in the middle of it, or maybe it's on that list that you're going to get to it. But I know for me personally, this time of round, this story, this narrative has really encouraged me and surprised me in new ways, which is always encouraging. With reading familiar passages, familiar narratives and stories, and discovering that they are speaking to you in new ways, specifically based on what's happening in your life. And so that's taking place for me, which is really, really encouraging. And so as we've looked at this narrative, we come to our theme of victory. And I wanted to, recap a little bit the narrative here in Genesis. But I want us to arrive at a place where we can reflect and then be able to participate in taking communion. So at the end of this reflection, there's going to be 3 questions that are going to be here on the screen, and those are designed for you to reflect, to share with the group that you are meeting with, and be able to participate in communion there together. Okay, so again, I want to do a quick walkthrough of the narrative that we find in Genesis, but then highlight 2 things that revolve around this theme of victory. So in Genesis, we know the creation story. God makes the world, and the world is good. And then we see, obviously, the fall and the sin that enters the world and corrupts everything. And then we have this surprise that God chooses to reconcile and redeem all things. That probably should not surprise us a whole lot. But what should surprise us is that of all the things God could have done to redeem and reconcile all things to himself, as Colossians 1 verse 20 tells us, God chooses to partner with humankind to accomplish this task of reconciliation and redemption. And he calls Abraham and Sarah and gives them a promise. And that promise is that through them, through their lineage, that God is going to bless all families on earth. And then we see that blessing be passed on from Abraham to Isaac, that blessing with this promise of partnership, of participation in God's redemptive and reconciling work of the fallen world. And then we see Isaac want to pass that blessing to his son Esau, but there's some conflict in the family. And so Jacob takes on that blessing instead of the one that was lined up to take that blessing, which was the oldest, Esau. So now Jacob's the youngest, takes on that blessing. And, as we read Joseph and we find out that Joseph is one of 12 sons of Jacob, there is this question that should be in the back of our minds as readers is, who will Jacob bless? Abraham blesses Isaac, Isaac blesses Jacob, and now Jacob will pass on that blessing. And so we are wondering, or we should be wondering, who will Jacob bless? And let's remember what's present in this blessing. What's present in this blessing is the promise that through this blessing, God will bless all families of the earth. And so let's hold on to that question, and then we'll come back to it here in a second. Another theme that we quickly find in Genesis 37 through 50 is how God is at work in hidden ways. On the surface, it does not appear that God is at work. Look at all the things that are taking place. Jacob's poor parenting decisions, the rivalry between his 12 sons, Joseph's own arrogance as he interprets this dream and places himself as the beneficiary, the protagonist of this dream, which only irritates and frustrates his brothers to the point that they want to murder him. And then it works out that Ishmaelites are walking by, and then they sell Joseph into slavery. And then Joseph is blessed, and God is with him, the Bible tells us. But then he's falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and then he's imprisoned. And then we are reminded again that God is with Joseph. And then Joseph, 2 years there, he blesses, or he interprets the dream of two men that were in trouble with Pharaoh, a baker and a cupbearer. And the cupbearer soon forgets the blessing and the help that he received from Joseph. And 2 years go by where Joseph had told the cupbearer, hey, please remember me when you're back with Pharaoh. Of course, the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. And so all of these things are taking place. I'm giving you kind of the quick summary of hopefully things that we're already familiar with at this point. But I mention all that to remind us of this. On the surface, it does not appear that God is at work. But God's work is hidden from even Joseph himself. If you recall Genesis 45 and 50, even Joseph says, hey, you guys intended to harm me, but God intended for something good. And so even Joseph towards the end is now realizing, wow, actually God was at work. And that is a victory. What is the victory? That though on the surface it does not appear that God is at work, it turns out that in fact God is at work. And so what does that mean for us? Well, how do you interpret life? How do you interpret the things that are happening in the world? How do you interpret the things that happen in your life? On the surface, it may appear that maybe God is not at work. And yet, seasons of life come and go, and we're able to look back and see God's presence in our lives. And every time we take the time to reflect and look back, many times we discover, wow, in fact, God was present. God was at work. And we can do that reflection individually. We can do that reflection as a family. And we can do that reflection as a church. And so we should continually reflect to discover how God has been faithfully present at work, providing up to this point. And so we see the providence of God, God's protective care for his promise, but also for his people. And so all of this leads to this encounter in chapter 47. And this encounter is between Jacob as an old man and Pharaoh. All right. So let's quickly summarize the things that I've said up to this point. I helped us remember this promise that God has made. And we should be asking, well, who will Jacob bless. And in the narrative of Joseph in the last part of Genesis, we're able to see how on the surface it doesn't appear that God is work, but then we realize, in fact, God has been at work. And so as readers, we know God has been at work, but for the people that are living out those things, it doesn't appear to them that God is at work. And so at the end there, God provides for Joseph. He provides for the brothers. He provides for all of the people in that known world because this famine is coming. And so we see the consistent victories of God, though man has many failures. And so we see the consistent providence, presence, work, and victories of God, though mankind, humankind, continues to fail. Though we constantly interpret on the surface, maybe God is not at work, we constantly discover later, wow, I was wrong. In fact, God is at work. And that is a victory of God. And so the promise and the providence of God moving along throughout Genesis, and it leads to this encounter that I want to highlight. And then we are going to reflect on some questions and participate in communion. Amen? So in Genesis, in chapter 47, we're going to read verse 7 through 10. Now, right before what I'm about to read, God appears in a vision to Jacob. And that's very significant because God has been appearing in visions all along. And now he speaks to Jacob for the first time in a long time, at least in this narrative. And God says to Jacob, don't worry, I myself, I'm going to go down with you to Egypt. Go ahead and go, and I'm going to use you to bless people there. And so there goes Jacob with God into Egypt to encounter Joseph and to enter Egypt. And, Joseph, there's a beautiful encounter there. And then Joseph sort of preps Jacob. He preps dad, kind of like, hey, before you have this encounter, just here's a heads up. And one of the things that Joseph says to Jacob is, the Egyptians find shepherds to be a detestable people. And then Joseph says, so when he asks you, so what is it that you guys do? Be sure to say, we're shepherds like our fathers were. And so I love that, sort of victory in some ways of Joseph not being ashamed of the vocation of being shepherds. And then Joseph selects 5 brothers and dad, and they come before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh asks some questions. And one of those is, besides how old are you, kind of what do you do? And they, with humble hearts, I think, they answer, we are shepherds. And then you have this beautiful encounter here. And so, verse 7, then Joseph brought his father Jacob in the presence of him and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, remember that question we should be asking? Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So remember that question we asked. Who will Jacob bless? And Jacob blesses Pharaoh. You see, God's work through his people included the promise that all families of the earth will be blessed through him. And so you see here God fulfilling part of that promise as Jacob blesses the outsider, Pharaoh. As Jacob blesses the one who sits in privilege as one who is a shepherd, one who is detestable in the sight of the Pharaoh, blesses Pharaoh. And so, what a shocker that we did not expect that. Now, later, Jacob does bless Joseph's sons, but we should not overlook what the Bible mentions 2 times in the passages that we just read, that Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And again, that should let us know, wow, God cares for all people. God cares for the world. And God does not show any distrust or he does not dislike Pharaoh, but sends Jacob to bless Pharaoh. And pharaohs are people that irritate us in general, right? Whenever we watch a sports or anything like that, we cheer for the underdog. And here we see a reversal, something we didn't expect. And that is, again, humble shepherd, old Jacob blessing Pharaoh. And if you can imagine what this scene looked like, we have an old shepherd who has been traveling, his clothes, his beard, he just does not fit in that palace. And then you have Pharaoh, probably clean shaved, probably wearing makeup, all kinds of attire and dressing and jewels. And then you see the curiosity of Pharaoh. How old are you? And what is it that you do? And then we see the blessing of Jacob to Pharaoh. All right, so what does all that mean? In some ways it reminds me how God encounters us, how Jesus encounters us. And many times Jesus encounters us in humble and simple ways. And so I imagine Jacob being more like God here, and you and I being more like Pharaoh, where many times we just have arrogance in our hearts. Many times we just have judgmental thoughts and attitudes. And yet here comes this humble shepherd. Here comes a crucified Messiah. Here comes the suffering servant who blesses us and offers us a new way of life. Calls us to come down from our self-made throne and to carry our cross and deny ourselves and follow him, to be like him, to dress in humility, clothe yourselves with humility, Peter would say. And so this is a beautiful encounter. And so we see God's faithfulness in his promise. We see the hidden ways of God's providence. And then we see this unexpected encounter and blessing. And I think we can identify more with Pharaoh than we can with Jacob. And maybe we should. And allow the humble ways of God, his promises, and his hidden at times providences in our lives to bless us, but also humble us. And so I hope that this reflection encourages deeper thought, new thoughts about all the things that God is doing in Genesis, but also in our lives and in the world and in the church. Amen. Here are some reflection questions as we take communion.